Thank you for joining me for today's episode of Once Upon a Crime. In this month's series, Buried Family Secrets, I'll share stories about family secrets held for decades that hid the criminal actions of one family member. In this week's episode, a young woman who'd heard stories all her life about her grandfather's control and abuse of his family members takes it upon herself to learn more. She is shocked to find that not only was Jim Mordecai feared by his spouse, ex-wives, and children, but he preyed upon other young girls and women in his community and may have been responsible for a series of murders of hitchhikers in Northern California. This is Chapter 2 of Buried Family Secrets, My Grandfather the Serial Killer, the Case of Jim Moriarty. Jim Moriarty was not a good man. Everyone in his family would agree with that statement. His 3 wives, 4 biological children, stepchildren, and grandchildren. He was abusive and narcissistic, and ruled his family by fear and intimidation. But to many outside the family, Jim Moriarty was a cool guy, a favorite teacher, a respected leader, and an admired mentor. They were fooled by his charm, which he could turn on and off like a light switch. When the switch was flipped on, Jim Moriarty's whole demeanor turned dark. Very dark, according to those unfortunate enough to witness it, but fortunate enough to live to tell the tale. Born in Northern California in 1941, Jim Moriarty was the son of a rancher/building contractor, Harold Mordecai, and his wife Evelyn. Jim graduated from Montgomery High School in Santa Rosa in 1960 and attended California colleges, ultimately earning a teaching degree with an emphasis in agricultural sciences. Mordecai married 3 times, beginning in 1960. His marriage to his first wife, Shannon, was a shotgun marriage that would dash his hopes of becoming a college football star. He'd played football at Montgomery High, and his skills on the field earned him a full-ride scholarship to the University of California at Los Angeles. But before he'd even packed his bags to begin his first college semester at UCLA, his high school girlfriend, Shannon, announced she was pregnant. Shannon and Jim's families forced them to marry. The wedding was quickly arranged, and their daughter Melinda was born a few months later. 5 years later, in 1965, they had a second child, a son they named David. Jim and Shannon divorced in 1972. During his marriage, Jim completed a college degree and briefly taught at Healdsburg High School, before being hired to teach agricultural science in the coastal town of Half Moon Bay. He began his teaching career at Half Moon Bay High School in 1967. Jim Moriarty proved to be a popular teacher. He also led an important high school club, the Future Farmers of America. The club, often referred to as FFA, is an American career and technical organization that offers middle and high school classes to promote and support agricultural education. Many Half Moon Bay High School students endeavor to join the organization, as participation in the club was prized on college applications. Jim Moriarty was an athletically built young teacher and one of the few male teachers on the faculty. He had self-confidence and swagger, and his students responded to his cool vibe and charm. To parents and school colleagues, Mr. Moriarty appeared to be a clean-cut, responsible family man. But once he'd earned the admiration of his students, Mordecai began taking advantage of their loyalty. He was inappropriate with his female students, making lewd comments about their bodies and their sex lives. He bragged to his male students that he'd had sex with some of them. Mordecai disparaged the girls he started rumors about, calling them whores and other humiliating names. Mr. Mordecai's classroom was often a free-for-all. Students could hang out and do what they wanted if they were on the teacher's good side. Mordecai took particular interest in some of his students playing favorites. Now divorced from Shannon, Jim lived alone. He invited hand-picked students to his home to smoke weed and use his hot tub. A year after his divorce, Jim Mordecai married Janae Kirkpatrick. He'd met the divorced mother of two at a church in Half Moon Bay and quickly swept her off her feet. Her two children, Christy and Michael, were 9 and 6 when their mother married Jim Mordecai on Christmas Day, 1973. Janae and Jim had 2 daughters together, Melissa, born in 1976, and Jamie, born in 1979. When Janae first met Jim, he seemed like quite a catch. He was handsome and kind to her and her children. His reputation as a respected member of the local high school faculty had also appealed to Janae. But soon after they married, there were problems. Janae would later report that her new husband, quote, got deviant sexually. He liked all that weird stuff, end quote. Worse than that, he became violent during sex. Jim Mordecai displayed a hair-trigger temper with his family. He became physically abusive to his wife and children when angered. Janae and the children learned to do everything possible to keep Jim calm and happy. It was an almost impossible task. Anything and everything seemed to set him off. During that time, it was just such hell, Janae recalled. His daughter Melissa remembered that as a little girl, she learned to be a calming influence on her dad when he, quote, flipped out. She lived to please him, Melissa says. In this way, she kept her family safe. It was a huge burden for a young girl to carry. Jim Mordecai became Christy's stepfather when she was 9. His attitude changed towards Christy when she was about 13. Where he had been short-tempered and mean to his stepkids since he'd married their mother, he became kind to Christy, giving her special treats and attention. When she was still in junior high, her stepfather invited her to tag along with his high school students on an overnight field trip. Christy was a year away from becoming a Half Moon Bay high school student and was excited about meeting some of the older teens. But once they were on the road, Jim told Christy that the other students could not attend, and it would just be the 2 of them. She became very apprehensive about being alone with Jim, but he remained upbeat, assuring her they'd still have a good time. He drove for a while, finally stopping at a roadside motel. He rented a room with 2 beds. Christy felt very uncomfortable with the whole situation, especially when her stepfather took a shower and walked out of the bathroom naked. She grew frightened when he got into her bed. She told him to sleep in his own bed, but he insisted, acting like it wasn't a big deal. He began to touch her, and Christy tried to fight him off, but he became aggressive and then violent. He sexually assaulted his stepdaughter. The following day, he drove them home. On the way, he warned Christy never to tell anyone what happened. He said no one would believe her, and besides, who's going to take care of your mom with 4 kids, he threatened. Jim Mordecai continued to rape his stepdaughter for the next year. He watched her every move, and the surveillance worsened when she became a student, where he taught. Christy couldn't escape Jim Mordecai at home or school. She would later describe her stepfather as, quote, a narcissist, a bully, a manipulator, homophobic, racist, violent, and psychotic. He was a horrible person, end quote. Mordecai even raped his stepdaughter on the school campus on one occasion. He cornered her in a remote area of the campus where the greenhouse was located, and Christy was working alone on a project. Afterward, he acted like nothing had happened, ordering her to get back to work as he returned to his classroom. Jim Mordecai had been abusing his stepdaughter for so long that he must have begun to feel invincible. Perhaps that's why he felt bold enough to attack her in front of witnesses. He lashed out angrily in a school hallway, grabbing Christy and throwing her against the lockers. Her mother heard about this incident and said it was the last straw. She told Jim she wanted a divorce. But escaping Jim Mordecai proved to be difficult. He became enraged when Janae said she was leaving him. He kept several guns in the house. He retrieved one, placed the muzzle into his wife's mouth, and told her he was going to kill her. Janae did her best to keep her wits about her and find a way to talk Jim down. She pleaded with him, "You don't want to do this. Your kids won't have a mother." To her great relief, he put the gun down and walked away. Janae escaped Jim Mordecai, succeeding in divorcing him in 1982 after 9 years of hell. But he would be obsessed with his ex-wife for the rest of his life. He called or showed up at her house repeatedly to threaten and harass her. He stalked her incessantly. Afraid of what her soon-to-be ex-husband was capable of, Janae gave in to his demands regarding their divorce. Jim retained the house and got custody of his 2 biological children, Melissa and Jamie. He threatened Janae that if she tried to take his kids, he would, quote, slit their throats. She was heartbroken at the thought of being separated from her girls, but decided not to fight Jim in order to keep her children safe. Mordecai compounded her pain by forcing his little girls to call their mother and tell her that they hated her. Jim Mordecai had been twice divorced when he met Judy Williams at a parent meeting at Half Moon Bay High. Her daughter Shannon was 15 and a student in Mr. Mordecai's class. Judy was a divorcee, and Mordecai zeroed in on the pretty single mom. He had a way of sniffing out vulnerable women and girls, turning on the charm to reel them in, and then just as quickly turning it off, becoming cruel and abusive as soon as they fell under his spell. Judy was flattered by the handsome high school teacher's attention. They had something in common. They were both divorced and raising children alone. They began dating. Shannon opposed her mother getting involved with her teacher from the start. She hated Mr. Mordecai. She thought he was a complete creep, always making comments about his female students' bodies, and was rumored to have sex with some of them. He seemed to enjoy this reputation. He'd even made obscene comments about Shannon in front of the class. She didn't hesitate to share her dislike of Mr. Mordecai with her mother. Jim Mordecai must have been aware that he couldn't manipulate Shannon the way he could others. Instead, he terrorized her. Mordecai lived about 20 minutes from Judy and Shannon, and when Judy would leave to make the drive to Jim's place, knowing Shannon was alone, he'd call their home phone. When Shannon answered, he'd make obscene and scary, violent threats. Shannon knew Mr. Mordecai's voice well. She knew it was him, but she had no proof, and no one believed her. So she was devastated in 1989, when her mother announced that she and Jim were getting married. Shannon was nearly 20 by then, and left home as soon as possible. Shannon had grown to love her stepsisters Melissa and Jamie, but in her opinion, her stepfather was the devil incarnate. She couldn't understand why her mother was so devoted to him. Judy was a stabilizing energy for Jim Mordecai, but even she didn't know the extent of his dark secrets. Shannon Barter became a young mother when her daughter Sierra was born in 1992. Struggling to finish college and provide for her daughter, Shannon moved home with her mother and Jim when Sierra was just a baby. She still didn't trust Jim Mordecai as far as she could throw him, but she needed their help. One night when her car was on the fritz, Jim offered to drive her to a night class at a college a few miles away and pick her up afterward. On the drive home, she sensed nothing out of the ordinary, except her stepfather was quieter than usual. Suddenly, he took an exit off the highway and onto a back road. He began driving faster, and she had no idea where they were going. The road was dark, and there were no other cars around. There was nothing but woods on either side. Shannon asked Jim where he was going, but he ignored her and drove faster on the winding road. She became frightened in anticipation of what he'd do next. Shannon wondered if her stepfather had indeed flipped a switch in his brain and was intent on harming her, or if he was behaving this way to scare her, or as some sort of threat. In any case, she'd had enough. With a firm but steady voice, Shannon told him to slow down and take her home now. To her relief, he did just that. It was as if the switch had flipped in the other direction. Without a word, he got back on the main road and drove directly home. Once they arrived at the house, Shannon packed up her things and the baby and told her mother she was leaving and wasn't coming back. She and Judy had a falling out after that day and didn't speak for years. Judy remained with Jim Mordecai until his death in 2008 from an aggressive form of cancer. Right after his death, Judy called her daughter and said, "We're safe. We don't have to be afraid anymore." Shannon's daughter Sierra grew up hearing terrible stories about her grandfather, Jim Mordecai. She didn't remember much about him, but she knew all the women in her family feared him. While attending college, Sierra studied filmmaking. She began writing a script about her family. She shared her stories with other film students as part of a class assignment. A producer sat in on one of her classes and heard Sierra's account of the abuse her mother, grandmother, and others had endured at the hands of her step-grandfather, Jim Mordecai. Through him, Sierra met documentary filmmaker Skye Borgman. Borgman had directed several true crime documentaries, including the blockbuster Netflix hit Abducted in Plain Sight. Borgman began working on a film documenting Sierra's journey to discover the truth about Jim Mordecai. What their investigation revealed was more than either had imagined. They spent 2 years interviewing family members and Mordecai's former students. What emerged was not only a portrait of an abusive husband and father, but of a sexual predator and a possible serial killer. The story they uncovered was chronicled in a 2024 documentary film titled The Truth About Jim. Sierra first interviewed her family members, some of whom shared for the first time the physical and sexual abuse Mordecai had subjected them to. A portrait of Jim Mordecai emerged through long-held family secrets now revealed. Jim Mordecai can be described as a narcissist with a God complex. He claimed to have lived many lifetimes, once as the prophet Moses. Mordecai's daughter Melissa described how her father had walked into her room one day, stretched out his arms, and asked if she could, quote, feel his power. He wasn't joking around, she said. He truly believed he was some type of divine being, special and set apart from others. To avoid conflict with him, Melissa responded yes, she did feel his power. Satisfied, he smiled and left the room. Mordecai's perceived superiority caused him to look down on most people. He ridiculed others, called people insulting and humiliating names, and bullied and intimidated them through his words and physical presence. He reserved his worst opinions for women. He often shared with his daughters his opinion that women were inferior to men and had been created by God solely to serve them. He believed men had the right to use women for their gratification and needs, and a woman's duty was to be subservient to men and grateful for the privilege. He twisted passages from the Bible to justify his beliefs. But he went even further, sharing a fantasy of having multiple women as slaves that would be required to serve him and do his bidding, including sexually. It was theorized that his low opinion and anger-fueled resentment of women may have had its roots in his childhood. His second wife, Janae, described Jim's mother as a, quote, mean, horrible person. But Mordecai also placed the blame for his future getting derailed on his first wife, who he'd gotten pregnant and been forced to marry. Whatever the reason for his rage against women, Jim Mordecai was not shy about sharing his violent fantasies involving women with his family. Sierra also interviewed her grandfather's former students. While many expressed admiration for their teacher, others told a much different story. Jim's stepdaughter, Christy, had a close friend in high school named Trishs. Trishs described how Mr. Mordecai began mentoring her after she joined the FFA club at school. She worked alongside him, and he singled her out for special assignments and praised her, raising her self-esteem. Trishs was a shy teen who didn't have a father figure. She was grateful to Mr. Mordecai for filling that role. But over time, his attention toward her became more personal. He offhandedly flirted with her and found ways for them to spend time alone together. He began expressing to Trish that he had, quote, developed feelings for her. At first, she was flattered. One day, Mordecai invited her to his home, and she accepted. This occurred before his marriage to Judy. Once there, he asked Trish to join him in the hot tub. He offered her weed to smoke and gave her alcohol. Trish, who says she was very naive as a teen, became alarmed when her teacher began to come on to her very aggressively. Where he had been charming towards her before, and she'd naively fallen for his compliments, he now became threatening and scary. Trish jumped out of the hot tub, grabbed her clothes — she had changed into a bathing suit he'd offered her — and ran out of the house. He ran after her and tried to grab her, but she was faster. She jumped into her car soaking wet and drove away as fast as possible. Another former student, Valerie, also volunteered to tell of her encounter with Mr. Mordecai. She was in his class and also a member of FFA. Valerie was another vulnerable teen who had shared her troubles at home with Mr. Mordecai at his urging. She was touched by his concern for her and considered him a mentor. Valerie loved horses, and Mr. Mordecai allowed her to care for Christy's horse as part of her FFA requirements. She felt honored and grateful. He asked her if she'd like to accompany him to take a horse to a breeding farm 2 hours away. He said they'd be given a tour of the farm and learn how the breeding operation worked. Val was excited and accepted his offer. On a Saturday, Mordecai drove Val to the farm. But she was disappointed when they arrived to discover there was no tour. Mordecai just dropped off the horse and began the drive back home. But instead of returning directly to Half Moon Bay, Jim said he needed to make a quick stop. He drove her to his family's cabin, located over an hour north of their final destination. The cabin was isolated, located on a 19-acre property. He made some excuse to get Val inside. Once in the cabin, he became aggressive and told her he wanted to have sex with her. She was trapped. His demeanor had flipped, and she saw a side of him she'd never witnessed before. She was afraid he'd hurt her more if she didn't comply. No one knew where they were. She feared for her life. Mordecai raped her, and she never told anyone what happened. Val said she thought, if he could do that to me, what else was he capable of? Sierra heard similar stories from a few other former students who didn't want to go on record. They reported that they too had been sexually assaulted by Jim Mordecai. Some had been attacked in the campus greenhouse, like her Aunt Christy. After 25 years of teaching at Half Moon Bay High School, Jim Mordecai's career came to an abrupt end. After resigning, he told people he'd retired from teaching to work full-time as a landscape architect. During her investigation, Sierra learned that a female student reported to school administrators that she'd been assaulted by Jim Mordecai. Long before she came forward, they'd heard rumors that Mordecai had, quote, been inappropriate with students, but didn't have proof. Now with a complaint officially lodged against him, they took the opportunity to ask him to leave. Why it wasn't reported to authorities is unclear. And Sierra's investigation led to another shocking discovery. A series of teenage girls had gone missing from Northern California between 1972 and 1973. Some of them were never found. Others were murdered and dumped in ditches along rural roads near Santa Rosa, California. The killer was never identified. Collectively, these cases became known as the Santa Rosa Hitchhiker Murderers, as most of the victims were known to be hitchhiking when they went missing. As Sierra began researching these 50-year-old unsolved murders, she realized with growing horror that the details of these crimes exhibited too many similarities with what she'd learned about Jim Mordecai to be ignored. She began to wonder, was her step-grandfather a serial killer? The Santa Rosa Hitchhiker Murders occurred between February 1972 and the summer of 1973. Over less than 2 years, 8 women and girls were killed by a person or persons unknown. All had been found nude, with most of their clothes missing. All the victims were white, of small to medium build, with long hair parted in the middle. All had pierced ears. Some were found with one earring missing. Most of the victims had been hitchhiking along Highway 101 in Sonoma County. The victims who were found had all been dumped in ditches along rural roads near the city of Santa Rosa. Most were found tied with ropes, or with evidence to suggest that they had been tied up at one point. 3 of the victims were found dumped in the same location. 2 had disappeared together. The 3rd had vanished over a year later. The similarities in the victims, where they had gone missing, the condition in which the bodies were found, and the locations where they were dumped, caused investigators to theorize that the murders may be the work of one individual. Sierra researched the Santa Rosa Hitchhiker murders and compared the evidence to what she knew about Jim Mordecai. In 1972, when the murders began, Mordecai was going through a divorce from his first wife. His ex-wife moved to Santa Rosa after they split up. Jim had moved in with his mother in Sausalito, a town just north of San Francisco. He often traveled Highway 101 to see or stalk his ex-wife. Most of the hitchhikers were picked up along Highway 101 near Santa Rosa. The areas where the bodies were found were not well-traveled roads. Investigators believed the killer knew the area well. According to family members, Jim Mordecai knew the remote areas of Sonoma County, quote, like the back of his hand. He'd grown up in the area, and his family owned property in Occidental, California, a town just west of Santa Rosa. His daughter called him the king of the back roads. Jim Mordecai always preferred to take the winding, wooded Northern California roads rather than the more direct routes. The victims were similar in age to the girls Jim Mordecai was known to prey upon, between 13 and 16 years old. They were also similar in appearance. His daughter Melissa shared a terrifying dream she'd had when she was 15. She dreamt that her father had raped her. Melissa said that she believed this was an anxiety dream because she knew that, at 15, she was, quote, the right age for him. The victims' bodies were found tied up and dumped in ditches. Jim's daughters recalled that when he'd get angry, Mordecai repeated violent threats about slitting the throats of his perceived enemies. He often said he wanted to hog-tie them and throw them into a ditch. He even used to play a game in which he'd hog-tie his children and then laugh, taunting them by saying, "How are you going to get out of that?" as they cried in frustration. It was well established that Jim Mordecai was a sexual predator, a violent man, and had access to weapons. He owned several guns he kept in the house, and always carried a large hunting knife in his truck. Of course, this was all circumstantial evidence. Sierra wanted real evidence to either prove or disprove that Jim Mordecai was directly connected to the murders. She uncovered a few details that appeared to do just that. Sierra's mother and grandmother, Shannon and Judy, told her about a box they'd found among Jim's possessions after his death. It was a shoebox filled with random items they'd never seen before, including women's jewelry. The items were inexpensive and of no real value, so they couldn't understand why he'd kept them. One other detail about these random items piqued Sierra's interest. There were unmatched earrings in the box. Sierra met with victim advocate Deb Silva, who'd been following the Santa Rosa Hitchhiker case for years. She ran a website dedicated to solving the decades-old murders, SantaRosaHitchikerMurderers.com. Deb had chronicled the details of the murders, and Sierra wanted to ask if she knew anything about missing jewelry. Unfortunately, Shannon and Judy had thrown the box of jewelry away years earlier, but Sierra asked them to describe everything they remembered. Her mother said the jewelry, quote, looked like something a young girl or teen would wear. She recalled a turquoise earring and remembered one item in particular. The box contained a single hoop earring with small orange beads attached. Shannon specifically remembered the orange beads. Pulling up her research, Deb Silva found an article and read it aloud. The article stated that one of the victims had been found with one of her earrings missing. It was a hoop earring with orange beads. Sierra also learned that Jim Mordecai had knowledge of where at least one of the bodies had been found. One day, he took his stepson Michael out for a drive. Jim drove to a remote area and pointed out a location. He told the 6-year-old that a dead girl had been found there. She was naked and hog-tied, he told Michael. Michael never forgot this odd outing with his stepfather. But the most chilling information Sierra discovered during her investigation concerned the first 2 victims in the Santa Rosa Hitchhiker murders. Ironically, they had not been hitchhiking. The last time 13-year-old Yvonne Weber and her 12-year-old friend Maureen Sterling were seen alive was on February 4, 1972, at a Santa Rosa ice skating rink. The skating rink was a popular place for kids to go after school. Some went there to spend the afternoon on the ice, but others just hung out in the rink's parking lot. Sierra interviewed the last person to see the girls on that day. Mary was a friend of Yvonne and Maureen. She was also at the skating rink that day. The 2 girls had gone out to the parking lot together. They returned sometime later and told Mary that they'd met a guy who'd offered to share his pot with them. They invited Mary to go with them. The girls pointed to a guy waiting in the lobby. Mary described him as a dark-haired man about 5 foot 10 inches tall, wearing a denim jacket. He was an older guy, not a teen. He looked more like a teacher to me, Mary recalled. The man didn't look in their direction, so she only saw him in profile. Mary thought it was weird that a man his age would be offering to smoke marijuana with 2 girls barely in their teens. Mary declined their offer to join them. Yvonne and Maureen said goodbye to their friend and left with the man. It was the last time anyone saw them alive. Sierra showed Mary a photo of her grandfather taken in the early 1970s. He would have been about 30 years old at that time. Mary studied the photo and had a very visible reaction. She did a double take and then looked at Sierra almost sympathetically. Sierra's reaction was immediate. She became emotional. Her heart began pounding, and she was on the verge of tears. Mary told Sierra the photo resembled the man she saw her friends leave with that day. Sierra hired Nina Hobson, a private investigator, to help her. Together, they compiled the information they believed pointed to Jim Mordecai as a suspect in the Santa Rosa Hitchhiker murders. In addition, Sierra asked retired FBI profiler Ray Carr to create a suspect profile of the person who may be responsible for the Santa Rosa murders. Carr's profile said the killer was most likely a white male in his mid to late 20s at the time of the murders. Jim Mordecai was in his early 30s. Carr also believed the killer had probably worked with children as a teacher or camp counselor. Jim Mordecai had already begun his career as a high school teacher. Furthermore, the killer would be very familiar with the area where the bodies were found. We've already established Mordecai's familiarity with the area. He would be very self-confident and have the ability to get people to trust him easily. Mordecai was skilled at grooming his victims, getting vulnerable young girls to trust him enough to confide their troubles to him. Some even thought of him as a mentor or father figure before they were sexually assaulted by Jim Mordecai. The killer would come across as a normal guy, but become dangerous when triggered. Mordecai's family members shared specific examples of how his personality would flip from normal to dangerous when he became angry. The killer may have engaged in voyeuristic behavior according to the profile. Both Mordecai's daughter and stepdaughter reported instances of him spying on them. He told his stepdaughter very specific things about what she'd done privately with her boyfriend. She didn't know how he could know these details unless he'd been spying on her. Two other points on the profile were chilling to consider. The killer would have most likely collected souvenirs from his victims. This would be a way for him to repeatedly relive his crimes. Sierra immediately thought of the box of random jewelry and other items found among Mordecai's possessions, especially the single earring that had matched the description of one belonging to one of the victims. Finally, the profile stated that the killer would most likely revisit the crime scene. Mordecai's stepson recalled their outing to a location where he told them a body had been found. It wasn't as if he just happened to drive past the area and stop out of curiosity, Michael said. He had the sense that he'd driven there specifically to share it with him. Years and then decades passed. The investigation into the Santa Rosa Hitchhiker murders had gone cold. After DNA began being used as forensic evidence to help solve cold cases, DNA was extracted from evidence still preserved from two of the murders. To rule her grandfather either in or out as a suspect in the Santa Rosa murders, Sierra needed to obtain a DNA profile of Jim Mordecai. To do so, a few of his personal items that may still hold traces of his DNA were collected and sent to a DNA laboratory. Some of his family members, including his daughter Melissa, provided DNA samples to help build the profile. Sierra collected all the evidence she had amassed during her 2-year investigation of Jim Mordecai and presented it to the Sonoma County Sheriff's Office in 2022. Investigators were impressed enough by what she'd discovered that they agreed that the case should be re-examined to determine if Jim Mordecai may have been involved in the murders. The case remains open, and the investigation is ongoing. It is as yet unsolved. For Sierra and her family, coming together to share their stories about Jim Mordecai and the abuse they suffered but never talked about has helped to dispel the fear, shame, and isolation they'd lived with for so many years. It has been a painful journey, but it has brought healing. By letting light shine on the truth, Mordecai's family may have uncovered an even bigger monster than they first suspected. Perhaps their courage in revealing family secrets may someday help other victims' families find answers as well. We can only hope. That will do it for this episode of Once Upon a Crime. I'll be back next week for another episode in the series Buried Family Secrets, and I hope you'll join me then. Once Upon a Crime is written and produced by me, Esther Sanchez-Ledlow. My executive producer is Lorena Garcia. Thank you once again for listening and sharing this podcast with others. Until next time, be good to one another.